Vermont. So, and super windy as well, which hopefully is still very windy right now. I'm hoping that doesn't mean I lose power. Right? I have a tendency to do that. So if I all of a sudden disappear, I apologize. Hopefully that doesn't happen here, but it's been known to happen in the past, but let's keep our fingers crossed for that. Yeah, I'm gonna try to share my screen, Monica, and we'll see what happens here. Hopefully you are seeing my screen now. Yeah, as Monica was saying, there have been several of these in the past. I think they've all been recorded. The first one really went into some kind of detail about tracking in general and things to look for, and kind of the basics of what it takes to be a good tracker. So I definitely recommend looking into that one if you haven't had a chance to see that, because that really kind of fills in a lot of the gaps that we won't be able to talk about too much today, because we're going to focus in very kind of finely on the rodents for the most part today. But still, as I say in all these programs as they begin, tracking is just a really great way to get to know the animals that you're sharing your neighborhoods and your national parks with, wherever you may live, and a great way to get better connected to nature, especially during these kind of isolation times. For me anyway, tracking is even more important than usual, just because it really keeps you kind of connected to the outdoors and what's going on as well. And I'm always, it's always something new to learn when you're tracking as well too. You're always kind of using your detective skills to try to figure out what you're seeing out there, which is why I do, like in tracking to being like a detective, very much like those TV shows that are out there today. Most notably, I compare it to CSI, which is a, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that program, where they usually have to use all sorts of fancy equipment with forensics and lasers and all sorts of photography equipment and special investigating things. But luckily for us trackers, we don't need any special equipment. Just our senses are all we need, really. Sight obviously is very important to be able to see what's going on, but you also use your sense of touch. You can feel the tree where the moose here has had something to eat, or the porcupine and the bottom here as well too. Your sense of smell comes in handy as well too. You can track just with your nose sometimes if you know that a skunk was nearby, or even a red fox as well too. They leave a very particular scent mark as well behind. So that's part of tracking as well, as are your ears too. Of course, animals are capable of making all sorts of sounds. So sometimes you can not even see an animal, just hear it. Red fox are a very vocal animal that you can often know they're there without seeing them. Same with coyotes and many others, of course. And yeah, so CSI is what we do for crime fighting, but CSI is what we do for tracking sign investigation. And these are all the animals that left those signs behind that we see here. But again, we're going to focus in mostly on the rodents today. So these are I think we've covered almost all these other animals that you see on here during some of the other programs, but it is an overwhelming list. It can be the list of usual suspects for the Northeast. It does look like there's an awful lot in there, but luckily, just like we share similar traits with our cousins and our parents and our nephews and nieces and all those kinds of things, animals are no different as well. Family groups, the mustelids, the weasels, they all share similar traits. They move in similar ways. Same with the dogs and the cat family, and same with the rodents and insectivores we're going to talk about today. They all have traits that are very similar. So it kind of helps break those down and make them maybe not quite as overwhelming when you're looking at those large lists of animals that it could be. If you're able to reduce it down to just kind of the family or order that they belong to, sometimes it makes it a little less overwhelming to try to figure out what you're seeing, and then you can kind of work your way from there. So we're just gonna go right down the list here. Hopefully, I think we should have enough time to cover them all on here. One of my favorite animals, just in general, just because they're so amazing and what they can do, and basically nature's engineers, the way they can change their environment, more so than any other animal besides human beings out there, is of course the beaver. They are a rather large rodent as far as the rodents go. Could be a full adult size beaver, anywhere from 45 to 60 pounds. So we're talking a significant animal here. And of course, very capable of kind of altering their environment to suit their own needs, which is a great trip to have. I'm going to see if this audio works. Hopefully, beavers, not known as the most vocal of animals, that most of their vocalizations are to their family groups that they're with. They're young, and the parents, often communicate back and forth with these, almost human-like, baby sounds to my ear anyway. But hopefully, we can maybe hear this sound here. This is young beavers communicating to each other. So, very kind of whiny kind of little sound there. And, with all these tracking programs, try to look at the animal's feet that we're talking about, because obviously, knowing what their feet look like will help you know what their tracks look like. And, I think everybody knows beavers have webbed feet, very large webbed feet in the rear, and much smaller feet up front. Very powerful hind feet that they propel themselves to the water very quickly and with great agility. A little more clumsy on land, not their favorite place to be. They obviously do travel across land, but feel much more at home in the water. And you don't often see their tracks in winter, just because they're spending most of their time in their lodges and under the ice, especially. But there are kind of the shoulder seasons when ice goes out and when they're moving about. And this time of year, when we get snow a little bit later, and some of the beavers are maybe looking for new territories, you might have a chance to see their tracks in the snow. And they're enormous. I mean, maybe you can barely make out my boot over here, size 11 shoe. And you can see the size of this beaver's hind foot here. So very significant track, and you can't really mistake a beaver track for anything else that you're seeing out there, just because there's nothing that has feet that large with webbed feet, and then these tiny front feet that you can see that are put in the snow there too. But you're not going to spend have a lot of luck tracking beavers as far as with their tracks. It's more for the other sign that you'll see, feeding sign here on this branch that they cut down, and they'll gnaw off the bark to get the cambium layer underneath here. It's their primary food source during the winter months, especially. This one did happen to leave, kind of fainter tracks in the mud here. This is the front foot, and then you can kind of make out where the hind foot was here as well too. And of course, beavers are, extremely well known for their ability to cut down trees. And in order to do that, they have these amazing set of teeth on their skulls. You can see when you look at the skull that they do have very large front incisors. And the reason they're so dark up front there is because that's actually a very hard surface layer on the front of the teeth that wears away at slower rates than the softer teeth behind it. So what that means is it gives it a very almost razor sharp edge because of the way that they wear away at different rates. And it's able to literally bite into a tree, which is pretty amazing ability to be able to do that and take it down. And maybe you can see on this photo here as well too, that they actually, their teeth come through an opening, the front teeth do, an opening in the lips here, so they can actually, kind of have their mouths open underwater without water getting into their mouths, because it's sealed off here, these front two teeth here, so they can actually pick things up with their teeth underwater without getting a mouthful of water, because those two front teeth actually poke out from beyond their lips when they're underwater. So it's another neat adaptation that we have. And yeah, I mean, again, there's no mistaking beaver sign. There's nothing else that does this in our region or anywhere really that can cut down a tree like this with their teeth. And they have several reasons for taking trees down, mostly to get food. They knock the tree down. Hopefully, it falls in the pond where they're at. They much rather have it do that way, and then they cut their branches off and use those for food later. We'll see some photos of that afterwards. And of course, they can also use those trees and branches to build the dams for where they live. So kind of building their own habitat. This is in central Vermont here, two fairly large dams. You see here, basically, I think this is about 6 feet tall almost when I was there in the Green Mountains. And they will build dams and use that water resource until the food runs out, basically, within easy access. Their primary food source, they really like aspen trees. It's by far their most favorite tree to kind of cut down and to use the foliage to eat. When that starts to get unavailable, they will go take down other trees as well too, but they really prefer aspen. And when those kind of run out, they'll just keep them moving down the watershed and damming the way along as they go, as well as their offspring. Their offspring will kind of move on as well too and find different parts of that watershed, hopefully, to dam and to start their own kind of family. This is the time of year actually when the young of the year, the previous year, is set out on their own to try to find new territories. So basically 2-year-old beavers are on the move, probably even as we speak. Unfortunately, this is also the time of year you tend to see them as roadkill a little more often than usual, because they are searching out on their own to try to find a place to start their own kind of family unit. And they do tend to get hit by cars a little bit more this time of year than when they're settled into their new territories. So you may see beavers on the side of the road, unfortunately, this time of year. This is an active beaver dam and lodge you just saw in the distance there too in central New Hampshire. Also, a fairly good size dam as well too, and to create their pond that they live in. And then, of course, eventually those dams will give way. Once the beaver decides to move on to someplace else, after a year or two, or sometimes a little longer, those dams need constant maintenance. So when they're not maintained for a few years, they will fall apart, and that whole pond will drain, leaving behind these beaver meadows. If you're bored one day, it's always fun to look at places where beavers are active on Google Earth. And you can kind of zoom in to places like Acadia National Park and parts of Canada and northern Minnesota and into this region too. And actually follow a watershed and you can see beaver meadows all up and down those areas where they're active. You can see active, sometimes the resolution is so good you can zoom in and actually see beaver dams and beaver lodges on those ponds, which is pretty amazing. The technology has gotten that well. And these beaver ponds are extremely important for many other forms of life. Amphibians, wood frogs are always using those as places to mate, as well as spring peepers and other things. Moose will use that as well too. They'll take advantage of beaver ponds for vegetation. And birds and many other species benefit not only from the ponds themselves, but then once those ponds drain, these beaver meadows become their own special kind of habitat, opportunities for new plants and trees to move in, and other species that are reliant on those. So beavers are one of those kind of keystone species that have an outsized impact on many other species that are around them as well. And this is kind of looking at the size of this very large beaver meadow that's left behind. An old lodge that you can see here that was once under the water. And a little bit of water left behind. There were hundreds of mating wood frogs. This is early spring a few years ago that we're actually still utilizing. That's what was left over of the water here. So it stays important for many years afterwards. And this is a look at 2 different lodges, one that is still in use on the bottom and one that is abandoned. You would never really see this much grass growing on an active beaver lodge. Beavers are maintaining their lodges very much as well, and wouldn't allow this kind of growth to be on their lodge. Newer lodges that are still in use still have kind of fresh looking branches on them, and are obviously have been occupied more. But this is, usually what's out poking out of the water. It's just the very top of the lodge, which, here would probably be, at this line here or so would be where this usually all you'd see. Most of the lodge is under the water, so the significant structure to the lodge is actually hidden away at these times. And the entrance to the lodge is usually underwater as well too. They'll come in from underwater, and you'll be able to. They have their residence obviously above the water. And if you're lucky, sometimes you actually be able to see, because there are living animals in there, anywhere from 2 to 5 or 6, depending on how many of the young that they have at the time. They're breathing and they're letting go. When they breathe, that has to escape out of the lodge at some point. Somehow, just like we see our own breath during winter, you can actually see beaver breath coming out of the lodge when it's being active. If you're lucky, you can kind of see it kind of oozing out of the beaver lodges themselves, which is pretty amazing. And this shows, this cutaway does, hopefully kind of show where the underwater entrance would be, roughly on this lodge, and to be able to come in and have this space here to raise their young and to kind of get out of the water and stay warm. That's a look at beavers. We'll look at.
I have a question about beavers.
Sure.
It says, I've occasionally seen that a beaver will girdle a conifer, usually a hemlock, sometimes knocking it down, sometimes not. It doesn't look like they eat from it. Are they just making a mistake?
Yeah, I've seen that before too, and it's rare. It doesn't happen a lot, but they will take down conifers. I've seen white pine as well too, not just hemlock. So I think they will actually feed on those. If there's nothing else that's available, they can actually eat the cambium layer of those trees as well too. I think maybe sometimes they'll test it out, they'll try it, and they'll cut it down, they'll test it out, and realize it's not to their liking at all, and they'll move on to something else. It's a lot of work to take down a tree, larger tree anyway, for them. So it's something that they don't do very often, but they will, if there's nothing much left available, they will take down some conifers sometimes to test them out as a food source. Is my guess. I've seen feeding sign on it, but just usually there's not a lot.
Thanks.
All right, so we'll move into some of the squirrel species here. We do have several in the Northeast. These are nobody's unfamiliar with the squirrel species that we have. They're diurnal species for the most part that we have here, except there is the southern flying squirrel as well too that we'll talk about in a minute. That is more nocturnal, so you don't often have chances to see them as much as you do. Of course, the gray squirrel, the red squirrel, and the eastern chipmunk are all very common and sometimes considered pests by a lot of people. They do can do some damage to your plants, especially when there's a lot of them around. I'm going to skip past the sounds here just because I think we all know what squirrels sound like. And take a look at their body shape and their tracks. This is a great kind of front-on look at a gray squirrel. You can really see the body build, much wider rear end hips, and the front feet are much closer together, which translates into the tracks that you see as well. They're pretty much bounders, meaning they push off with their front feet, and the hind feet come around the front feet and land in front of them. So these are the two front feet down, just like that. And when they're moving, the hind feet are, launched out in front and land in front of where the front feet are. So the two hind feet show up there. I think you can kind of see that in some of these photos, as it leaps through the air and lands with the two front feet. The hind feet, as you can see in this picture, land in front of those front feet. So that's why, it leaves a track pattern it does. And that's true for all the species, not just the gray squirrel that you see here, but the red squirrel and the chipmunks as well, all move in that same way, very much a bounder. And this is why we see these kind of sets of tracks like this, especially in shallow snow here. This is just on a street, more or less a dusting of snow. It doesn't really affect the way that they move. as the snow gets deeper, they kind of morph into just a kind of a set of tracks here, where it looks like you only see the front, the hind feet, but the front feet are in there. They're just kind of all bunched more together because as the snow gets deeper, they kind of bunch those tracks together a little bit more. And often, especially these are tree-dwelling animals, just as comfortable or more comfortable maybe in trees as they are on the ground. So, almost always, if it's not going to your bird feeder or something like that, their tracks are headed towards or from a tree, and sometimes they disappear up the tree. Rabbit tracks can sometimes be confused for squirrel tracks. Sometimes they look a little bit different, but they can be somewhat similar. But you'll never see rabbit tracks disappearing up a tree. So that's always a good clue for you if you're not sure and you're able to follow them for a little bit. If it's disappearing up a tree, you have a good chance you're looking at squirrel instead of rabbit. Looking at the difference in sizes here, between red squirrel, obviously gray squirrel is the largest squirrel that we have here, and then the red squirrel is in between that. And you can see the tracks here similar, 2 front feet, 2 hind feet, and then of course the chipmunk is even smaller, about half the size of the red squirrel. So red squirrel is about half the size of a gray, roughly, and eastern chipmunk is about half the size of red squirrel, roughly. So it kind of helps you get a picture of the size of the tracks that you're looking at. Red squirrels are much more common in conifer forests. Their primary food source is the seeds of pines and hemlocks and spruces, as opposed to gray squirrels are much more common in upland kind of oak forests. They're very much more dependent on acorns than they are on other food sources. So more often you're going to see red squirrels and gray squirrels not overlap a great deal, but they do some, of course. And because they're a little bit smaller, the red squirrels are affected more by snow depth. Their track tend to, especially as the snow gets deeper, do tend to kind of morph together in these interesting, almost like Batman symbols, sort of in the snow that you see here, as opposed to gray squirrel might be able to not be as affected by snow depth as the red squirrel. And eastern chipmunks are hibernators. You're not going to really see their tracks in the middle of winter. They're spending their time under the snow that time of year. We'll have a slide about that in a moment as well. And as I mentioned before, we do actually have flying squirrels here. They're called the southern flying squirrel because they are kind of a northern species. There's a northern flying squirrel that's even farther up north in Canada and other parts like that. But here in the Northeast, we have the southern flying squirrel. That's not confusing. And they are primarily nocturnal. You're not really going to see them active too much. Sometimes when people clean out their bird houses for the year, they find evidence or actual southern flying squirrels in there because they are cavity nesters. They do nest in cavities of trees, and they will take over bird houses too. It suits them. It's just like a great spot for them to build their own kind of nest as well. And what you're seeing here is actually kind of tracks of a southern flying squirrel. This is called a SITZ mark, S-I-T-Z, one of those great tracking terms. This is where a southern flying squirrel, which aren't flyers, of course, they're gliders. They have these amazing flaps of skin that they can spread out and glide from tree to tree. They try to usually, land in another tree, go from one tree to the next. They don't often land on the ground. They're, kind of awkward on the ground again with these, big flaps of skin. They can obviously hop on the ground, but they'd rather stay in the trees for the most part. But when they do land on the ground, they kind of skid, come to a skidding landing here, which is what you see here. And then it did hop its way, further to the next tree. Not sure why this one landed in kind of the middle of this opening in the forest. It had to change its trajectory at the last minute if the predator was coming after it. People who observe flying squirrels find that when they do land on a tree, like they launch from one tree and land on another tree, they almost immediately go around to the backside of the tree that they just landed on, just in case something is right behind them and wants to kind of try to pick them off. They try to kind of go around the tree and hide real quick just to make sure they're not being chased by something else. But yeah, you're not going to come across their tracks very often. And then we have, of course, the eastern chipmunk here. I haven't seen them in my yard yet this year. I'm sure any day now they're going to pop out. They do spend the vast majority of the winter under the snow and under in their little kind of underground cavities that they make for themselves. They will wake up occasionally underground. They do actually store food underground for the winter, and they will wake up from time to time and eat. And then they have another kind of chamber underground that they can use for a restroom, and then go back to their sleeping chamber and sleep for days at a time. But so they don't stay completely knocked out the entire winter. They do have very minimal activity that time of year. And you might see them in the fall pulling leaves down in a hole and maybe some food and things like that, kind of setting up their place for the winter. And imagine, any day, in Central Vermont anyway, I haven't seen them yet, but imagine, some of you probably already are seeing chipmunks, I would imagine, at this time of year. So they're going to become very active soon. This is just a representation of how they look when they're sleeping underground, curl themselves up and use that tail to kind of tuck in and spend a lot of their time sleeping this time of year, which I think a lot of people are jealous of their ability to sleep away the winter and then, kind of wake up in the spring. Feeding sign for the different animals. Gray squirrels will eat acorns. Of course, as I was saying, that is their primary food source, but so do red squirrels will also eat acorns, but they're much more well known for eating of the seeds that are found at the base of kind of the pine cones and spruce cones. They'll pull those apart and get to the base of where they're attached to the kind of the spine of the cone, and that's where the little seed is. And red squirrels going to have their favorite spots where they like to sit and pull those cones apart and then kind of drop them as they go. And they can leave these rather large, what's called a midden pile, midden. Over the years, they can pile up to be some pretty impressive piles of leftover cones. Looking closely, you might be able to see this is kind of the spine of one of those spruce cones that the squirrel is eating here. So this has been taken quite a while to build up a pile like this. And chipmunks also eat acorns. Maybe you might be able to notice here, interestingly enough, the larger the squirrel species, the smaller bits left behind of the acorns. So the gray squirrel has the smallest pieces of acorn behind. I think it's probably because they have larger mouth and larger teeth. They need to kind of really break it apart to get to the meat of the acorn inside there. Whereas red squirrel's a little bit smaller and a little bit smaller teeth, so it doesn't have to mix small chunks to get at the meat that's inside there. And of course, the chipmunk, being the smallest, is able to kind of gnaw them apart and really get inside there with its tiny teeth and kind of clean everything out of the acorn without having to break it down completely. So if you do find bits of chewed on, kind of, if you look at the edges, where you really see the evidence of their teeth marks when they're breaking apart, as opposed to something like a deer that might pick up acorns and really chew them and pulverize them a little bit more than you see these whole pieces when it's a squirrel species that's eating it. Okay, that's our squirrel friends. Take a look at muskrat here. They are a very water-loving species. Sometimes people confuse muskrat with beaver, especially when they're seeing them in the water, kind of swimming. But muskrat are much smaller, by far, than beavers are. 1.5 to 4 pounds for a muskrat, as opposed to, remember, it's 45 to 60 pounds for a beaver. So much larger, and of course their tails are very different as well. Long, both of them have furless tails, but of course the beavers are flat tails that they use, very much to help them swim in the water. And it's up and down for beavers. It's kind of up and down motion. And for the muskrat, which are long and narrow tails, those are a back and forth motion, which you see it in the water. Hopefully you'll be able to see their tail and see how they're propelling themselves differently than the beavers are. And they can use the tail for support too when they're sitting on ice. Here's this one. Muskrats also make lodges, but unlike the beaver, you're not really going to see lots of sticks that were cut down for to build their lodge. It's much more plant reedy material that you'll see here, and kind of much more of a mound, a small mound shape, usually right by the edge of a wetland too as well. It's obviously the same material they use to build their lodge, so it looks quite a bit different than a beaver lodge. Their feet are not nearly as webbed either as, kind of surprisingly for an animal that spends so much time in the water. They're pretty much not webbed at all, which you think you would see that for muskrat, but they're not. And also obviously much smaller tracks than you would see for beavers as well too, because of the size of the animal. And if the conditions are right, and often, spending so much time by the water, they do leave tracks in mud, fairly often. When the mud's just right, you can see the ribs almost even kind of in the toes that you see here in this muskrat's rear foot. And the rear foot is much larger than the front foot, but kind of long toes too, that you can see on the toes here, and long claws as well. Mostly for kind of digging things up, not really a defensive mechanism or offensive really. They're mostly vegetative matter for the most part. And you can see somewhat of kind of the walking pattern left by the muskrat here with an overstep walk. So again, the smaller one is the front foot, and the rear one steps over where the front foot was. Just like if you've been following this series along, most animals, the hind foot lands in front of the front foot. Very often, it's not uncommon at all. It's more common perhaps in other ways. Some animals we talked about do a direct register where the hind foot lands exactly on top where the front foot was. And you'll see that as well sometimes in muskrat too. But when there's fast walk, the hind foot oversteps the front foot. And seeing more evidence of that here, and with their kind of long tails as well too. It doesn't always leave marks behind. As you can see in this trail here, there is no tail, but as the snow gets a little deeper, that tail might leave some marks in the snow, almost like whip-like tracks that you see here left behind by their tail. And then this is where the tail was dragging to, and it looks something like this. Where this muskrat is moving along and the tail was being dragged behind it, just like that. So you can see kind of how that might have been left behind. Okay, another fun one. Porcupine is another pretty amazing animal that's able to use its teeth much to its benefit, but also, of course, it has these amazing defensive ability too. Having these quills all over its body. The quills are kind of tucked under the hair. It does have hair as well as quills that are underneath the body there. When it feels threatened, it can raise the quills. They can't shoot quills. I think that's mostly. I think not a lot of people think that anymore, but there was a time when people thought they could actually kind of shoot the quills out of their bodies to defend themselves. They do have to be actively bitten. Or attacked to have the quills come out, but they do release very easily. And I'm sure there are some people out there that have been unfortunate enough to own dogs that have found that out the hard way as well too. Where some dogs never seem to learn their lesson. They get quilled multiple times. But a lot of animals do know that porcupines are really not worth the effort to hunt, especially if there's other readily available prey out there. If prey starts to become harder to find, they will kind of have take their chances with porcupine. Great horned owls are known actually to kind of actively hunt porcupine, as well as fisher that we have here can also be daring enough to go after porcupine as well. But there's not a lot of other species that really like to do that. And of course, the quills do have barbs, so they actually work their way deeper into the victim. Once they're in there, just by the natural kind of shuddering of the victim that has the quills in there. Every time they shudder a little bit, the quill actually worked its way deeper and deeper into it. There've actually been people who found great horned owl carcasses, and when they've been autopsied, they've actually found quills that have penetrated the heart of the great horned owl, because it kept on working its way deeper and deeper in, and until it got to the heart of the animal, which is sounds like not a pleasant way to go for sure. Porcupines also kind of have similar kind of sounds, I think, as the beaver did. And again, these are usually just communicating sounds to each other, family units. Hopefully you can hear that, kind of a humming, little murmur sound. And their feet are very specialized as well too. They have very kind of pebbly feet, and it helps them get a grip when they're climbing up trees, where they spend a lot of their time as well. And sometimes if the conditions are right, you can kind of see some of that pebbly texture in the mud. Very long claws, which again are mostly to help them climb, to help them dig as well. They will dig what are called truffles, which are kind of under the ground in forests. They dig those up pretty often and eat those, kind of a fungus that they specialize in. This one really shows that pebbleized quality texture of their feet very well. And this is another overstep walk, just like we saw with the muskrat there. So this is the front foot, and the hind foot oversteps where that front foot was. You can see that in that trail pattern there. This is in the snow. It's once you kind of get an eye of what they look like, even when they're not very clear tracks, you can kind of tell what you're looking at. And this is the heel of the animal here, and then the claws up top here. So it helps to really know what they look like, and then you can kind of tell when the tracks aren't as good. They will sometimes drag their tail behind them, which can kind of obliterate a lot of the tracks that you see in here, but very clear kind of quill drag marks that you see through this pattern here. So nothing else is going to have a tail like that. Of course, the porcupine has, but they don't always drag. And when they don't, and they do utilize that kind of direct register as well too. So each hole in the snow here is a front foot and a hind foot. And they tend to be kind of pigeon-toed. I think that's I always get confused. What's when the toes point outwards or point inward. These are the feet are pointing outward walk here, which is kind of a telltale sign for porcupine as well too. That you see that pattern left behind there. And as the snow gets even deeper, they will kind of utilize some of the same feeding areas throughout the winter. If they find a hemlock that they really like, they'll come back and forth to it several times, and they end up wearing out these kind of channels almost in the snow as it gets deeper that they reuse over and over again. And if you see one of these and you get up close to it, you'll often find quills that have fallen out and hair and everything. It seems if they use them enough, there's always signs that they leave behind in there. This is another look at one of those channels that this one had done, and it did go up this hemlock tree many times over the winter, this particular spot. And just like the beaver, the porcupine as well has that similar style teeth. I don't know if I mentioned this for the beaver, but their teeth they never stop growing essentially, because obviously they're wearing them down every time they're chewing on wood, so they have to continue growing. And sometimes, for whatever reason, if a beaver gets ill or a porcupine gets ill and isn't using its teeth the way it should, they can grow so much that the animal can't use them anymore, because they're sticking. They look like elephant tusks almost as they come out of their mouths, because they've grown so much. So you can see that occasionally in them, and usually that animal doesn't live very long once they get that long. This is feeding sign of a beaver in a hardwood tree. They will kind of climb up the tree here, hang on and gnaw away at the tree using their incisors. Again, they're trying to get to that underlying cambium layer of the tree, and that's their nutrients, for the winter months. And they will do hardwood and softwood trees. These are pines here as well, so they will do quite a bit of damage to the tree over that time period. Larger trees, even smaller trees as well too. They can almost completely denude. Porcupines are not the favorite animals of a lot of forest managers. If there's a lot of them, they can actually do some damage to the forest. But overall, they're not really doing. The forest obviously fine with porcupines. It's if they're being managed for money, sometimes they're not the most favorite animal of people who are managing their forests. This is a close-up look of the sign of the porcupine on this hardwood tree, the way that the teeth pattern shows up, and the way the teeth pattern shows up on a softwood tree. Looking at them closely together there. So really, there's no other animal that will do large swaths of, especially high up in the tree, feeding like this than the porcupine. And on the smaller trees, the diameter, they seem to come together in this V shape that you'll see coming up and down the length of the tree as the porcupine's working its way around the tree. But they also will eat kind of the terminal buds of especially hemlocks, and when they cut the branch, those very sharp teeth almost look like shears were used to cut the branch. And you'll find just loads of branches at the base of a tree, which we'll see in a second here, where they've been feeding. And of course, a clear sign of porcupine activity is their dens. One thing that you're going to see at an active den is a lot of scat, a whole lot of scat coming out of the dens. This is winter scat. This is very woody, material kind of scat that kind of flows out of these trees. Some people find it kind of unpleasant to, imagining living in your house with just scat everywhere. But one of the reasons scientists think that they might do this is one, it might deter other animals from wanting to move into their lodges. If it's filled with their own scat, it's a little less desirable for other animals to try to kick them out maybe and use that as a lodge. And also, it might even provide some form of insulation because it is, kind of sawdust almost, and especially as it starts to break down. You can see this breaking down as this comes out of this large sugar maple tree here. It can actually provide somewhat of an insulation layer too to their lodges. Where rocky ledges are available, that is their preferred kind of place to build a den, but they will, if large hollow trees are in the area too, they will actually use those as dens as well. And underground, I've seen it as well even. That's fairly uncommon, but this is a porcupine who's using this as its den. It might have been excavated by a different animal. They're not usually known as excavators all that much, as far as I know, but they might reuse a woodchuck den or something like that that had been abandoned for whatever reason. And you can see the scat even around this den here that they were using. I kind of knew to look for porcupine activity in this area because when I was walking by, I saw all these branches down. These are all hemlock branches, and whenever I see that, I always go up to take a closer look at those branches, and that's where you see those that they've been cut pretty clearly by the mouth of a porcupine. And then I was looking around, and I found this is where that picture we just saw was of this place where this porcupine was spending its time in this underground den right nearby, which is it's kind of fun to find all that stuff all together there. All right, and I think I'm gonna try to move on a little faster here because we are coming up on the hour, but these will go pretty quickly. Looking at our different, kind of our much smaller rodents and insectivores that we have here. Our mice moles and our shrews and our voles. Moles right off the tongue. And there are many different species actually. Very hard to tell the difference sometimes just by looking at them, but also of course with their tracks as well can be a little tricky. But we do have white-footed mouse or deer mice, the amazing star-nosed mole here, which has these amazing appendages off the sides of its mouth, its nose. I guess it's just called the gray mole, I believe. We have several different kinds of shrews as well. We have a couple different kinds of voles. We have meadow voles, and we have redback voles, which are more in the forest. Moles that spend their time in the water as well too. So we have many different kinds of these species here. We won't spend too much time trying to figure out the differences between them. But mice are, they're everywhere, as you know. They're in the forests, they're in the fields, they're in your house, of course. And they are bounders for the most part too. One of the more common tracks you're going to see in the woods are mice tracks in winter, especially. And these again are the front 2 feet that you're seeing here, and then the 2 hind feet come along and bound over those front feet and leave the signs here as well. So this is a very typical mouse pattern that you'll see. This is actually them walking pattern of mice, and if you can see, zooming in on his foot here, they do have these very fine kind of points and toe pads and heel pads on their feet that will show up in the right conditions in their tracks here. Which are, it has to be just the right conditions, of course, to be able to see that. Looking at their trail patterns, they do tend to leave tail tracks when they're bounding through the woods. Their long tails do tend to kind of show up behind them here. So, more often than not, you're going to see that there are kind of long tails right behind them on both of these, which isn't always the case with some of the other species. This was just a kind of an interesting trail I came across a few years ago back in Marsh-Billings, the park in Woodstock, Vermont. You can see from my snowshoe tracks here, there's a crusty layer on top. And I think this mouse just kind of got stuck on top of the layer, and for whatever reason can kind of dig its way back underneath this very crusty layer. And this is actually it going back and forth on the same trail here. And I followed it eventually to the base of this tree. And then I found the poor mouse itself here, frozen solid outside the surface layer of the tree here. So I'm not sure. It was about 20 below on the night before, so I'm not sure if the thing, for whatever reason, couldn't find its way back to under the snow, or it'd be quite a bit warmer than 20 below. But this one did not survive the night there, and it was an interesting thing just to find that. Don't find that very often. What you do find sometimes, if you're lucky, are the signs of other things that like to eat mice. And there's many things, predators that eat a lot of mice, which is lucky for us, because otherwise we'd be overrun with them. They do produce prolifically, and there's lots of them out there. But owls, especially, like to eat mice. Barred owls, great horned owls, the main species that we have here, that will swoop down and land right on top of one, and then you'll see the wing marks of the owls in the snow, which is always a really neat thing to see. And then of course the mice tracks and there's no more tracks after you see the wing prints in the snow. This is an amazing photo I found online of a great gray owl. The last moments of that field mouse there before this great gray owl makes a meal of this mouse there. We do have a couple different species of voles here as well too. The redback voles are primarily in the forest, and the meadow vole, as its name makes you guess, are usually in open areas, meadows and fields and things like that. But they're both of them are active here. They tend to be more trotters and hoppers or bounders here. This is the trotting pattern of a vole, red-backed vole in the woods. And they make their living underneath the snow layer for the most part this time of year, or during the winter. As the snow is melting as it is now, it reveals all these tunnels that the meadow voles especially have been using throughout the winter. And sometimes they actually have little, latrines, little bathroom areas that they'll use under the snow too, and other places where they'll bring food and spend their time there. This is a vole that couldn't figure out that it was on top of ice. It was trying to tunnel its way down in, but couldn't make its way in. So sometimes you'll see patterns like that. Voles this year did see every few years or so, they'll kind of have a big outbreak, and the species will really jump, numbers will jump high. just anecdotally this year, I seem to notice a lot more mole damage in my yard. I think we're gonna see some photos in a second of some of that, but just to keep that in the back of your head for a second. We also have the shrew species that are here. Shrews are very interesting, especially the northern short-tailed shrew is a really interesting animal. It spends most of its time under the leaf layer and under the snow as well too. Very tiny eyes are very good for seeing. They can tell different shapes and things like that, but they're not meant to be really used above ground very much because they're not above ground very much. Sometimes animals will catch them. This is fisher tracks here. This is a fisher that actually caught a shrew. There's a shrew, and it didn't eat it. The reason it didn't eat it is because shrews can emit this really off-putting musk kind of as their last act when they're bitten. And oftentimes it'll be rejected by mammals, especially things like fisher. This fisher spat it out and then actually scent marked on top of it as a kind of a sign like, all right, I'm good with this one. I don't need to try that again. I'm just going to leave this mark for myself here so I know, this is not anything to be concerned with. Shrews also are one of the very few venomous mammals. They actually have a venom that can paralyze or kill other prey. Mice are quite a bit larger than shrews, and they can actually kill at any given time. Supposedly, some studies have shown that they're carrying enough venom within them to dispatch up to 200 mice at a time. That's how much venom they have within them to take care of mice. So, a pretty amazing thing for a small animal like this to have that kind of venom in them. This is a close-up look of that shrew that was rejected by the fisher. And this is just some more trail patterns of shrews and voles. They have these trotting patterns. They have these kind of bounding patterns here, as well as the more very similar bounding patterns that we'll see with the mice, and again, the front 2 feet and hind feet. Moving through this quickly because of time. I apologize for that. These are the very telltale signs of moles as well too. This is at the National Park in Woodstock after a particularly kind of active mole year where the whole lawn was kind of seeing these mole tunnels all around the place. And they can sometimes do a lot of damage, especially young fruit trees and other saplings of other species. This is once the snow melts away, this is what you see, because under the snow they were feeding on the cambium layer of these trees. Vole, it's helpful to remember sometimes, vole are vegetarians, V for vole, and moles are meat eaters. Moles eat insects and things like that. So moles for meat and voles for veggie kind of helps you realize the voles are primarily vegetarians. And can girdle trees completely and kill them. I've lost, forgot to put kind of those protectors on the tree before the snow sets in, and I've lost some apple trees myself due to vole damage. So just something to be aware of. If you do plant anything this year, especially if they're young, small diameter trees, you want to try to protect them from the moles underneath the snow. And lastly, we have the woodchuck here, which is another animal that will start becoming very active soon if it hasn't already where you are. The bane of gardeners everywhere. They do love eating our fresh greens that we put out there. Pretty much broccoli, lettuce, all sorts of stuff that you try to grow out there. They will eat it right down to the ground, and there won't be much left to it. And they're very happy to have your salad bar for them if you provide that for them out there. And they are mid-range in size, kind of larger than a muskrat, but much smaller than a beaver as far as the rodents go. And they can climb trees. Most of their time is spent on the ground or under the ground, but they do have the ability to climb trees as well. And their feet look kind of in a similar vein to what we saw for the muskrat, kind of these ribbed, pretty much hairless feet that they have, in the front and hind feet as well that you'll see there. And seeing that in the track patterns, they do tend to leave kind of these crooked looking trail patterns or foot pattern here. This kind of looks like it's almost bent, just the way that with their feet land that it looks. So that's kind of one of the telltale signs of woodchuck when you're seeing that in the mud. And they are pretty much as true of a hibernator as we get. So you're really not going to see their tracks in the winter. They're spending their winter underground, and they do spend weeks to months at a time, kind of in a complete hibernation state. They're one of the more complete hibernators that we have here. It takes them quite a while to kind of come out of that, rouse themselves out of that for their kind of metabolism and heart rate and everything to come up to normal. So they're pretty groggy when they first kind of wake up from their winter naps. But there is still snow on the ground sometimes, that you will have when they do come up, especially if you get a late storm. So you do have the opportunity to see their tracks in the snow sometimes, and this is one of those lopes or bounds. So this is a front foot and a front foot and a hind foot and a hind foot here. So again, this is that rule of thumb: the faster the animal goes, the farther its hind feet land in front of the front feet. So it's kind of a for a woodchuck anyway, a pretty good speed of animal moving. And they also do walk as well too, where often you kind of get this imperfect direct register where the hind foot lands almost where the front foot was, but not quite. It's a little sloppier than something like a red fox or other animals that direct register almost perfectly. They're known as perfect direct register, and this is an imperfect. It's kind of sloppier than some of those other species. And that about wraps it up for the rodents and the insectivores. So I think, right at 1 o'clock again. So timing out came out pretty good. I'm happy to answer any questions you guys might have. If Monica can help me with figuring out what those might be.
Yeah,
Otherwise,
thanks, Ed. That was really great, as always. We do have a couple questions in the chat. One quick one is, do muskrats hibernate?
Muskrats are active during the winter, as far as I know. That's a good question, actually. I'm gonna have to say that I'm not sure about that one. I don't think that they do, but I'm not 100% sure on that one. But that's a good question. My inkling is to say that they don't, but I'd have to look into that. But obviously, that's something that can easily look up. I've seen their sign in the winter, so I assume that means that they're not hibernating. But they could certainly reduce their activity levels during that time. I think they stay pretty active during winter.
All right. And second question is just, could you cover flying squirrels? I don't know if you have more slides to that or just more information on flying squirrels.
That was pretty much it. Being a tracking program, they don't leave a lot of sign behind. What I showed there, kind of with that sits mark, that skidding mark in the snow, is really what you're going to find, unless you have to find the animals themselves again. I've had the opportunity to clean out old birdhouses and find the actual flying squirrel family inside there, which I thought was a little surprising to see that. But as far as more information on flying squirrels, I don't really have much more than
Okay.
that.
If anybody else has any further questions, you can just drop them in. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. And there'll be more working woodland workshops in the future. So look out from communication from Joey on those. But yeah, thanks for coming, and thank you to Ed, of course, for another wonderful and fascinating presentation.
Thanks, everybody. Right, well.
Do we just hit end? All right. Thanks, Ed.
That's good. Thanks, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.